I've always had a fascination with legends and myths, so when I heard about the Black Forest in the Appalachian Mountains, I couldn't resist the urge to check it out. What started as a simple camping trip quickly turned into something much darker and more sinister. The Black Forest is known for being remote and isolated, far from any well-trodden path. Right from the beginning, I had this unsettling feeling that I was being watched. The first thing I noticed was how the light seemed to be swallowed by the dense canopy above. The forest was eerily quiet, save for the occasional rustling of leaves, and the shadows cast by the towering trees seemed to shift and dance on their own. I set up camp in a small clearing, which I hoped would offer a bit of respite from the oppressive gloom of the forest. As the day wore on and evening approached, the unsettling feeling of being watched only grew stronger. The forest seemed to come alive with an unsettling energy. The silence deepened, becoming almost suffocating. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, just beyond the edge of my vision. When night fell, the forest took on a new, more terrifying dimension. The darkness was almost palpable, wrapping around me like a shroud. Every sound seemed amplified in the stillness. The distant hoot of an owl, the crackle of twigs breaking underfoot. It was as if the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I tried to sleep, but every little noise made me jump. My dreams, when I finally did drift off, were plagued by nightmares. I saw shadowy figures moving between the trees, their forms indistinct and unsettling. Whispers filled my ears, incomprehensible and urgent, as if the forest was trying to communicate something I couldn't understand. Waking up from those nightmares, drenched in sweat and with my heart racing, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The Black Forest was not just a place of natural beauty, but seemed to harbor a dark, malevolent presence that was slowly revealing itself. When the first light of dawn filtered through the trees, I felt a slight sense of relief. I convinced myself that it was just my imagination running wild during the night, and decided to explore the area around my campsite. The daylight seemed to offer some semblance of normalcy, but it wasn't long before I realized that the forest was still just as unnerving. I set off on a narrow trail that I hoped would lead me to something more interesting, maybe a stream or a viewpoint. The air was cool and damp, and the forest floor was littered with fallen leaves and tangled roots. As I walked, I noticed that the trail was barely visible in some places, swallowed up by the undergrowth. It was strange how the forest seemed to be closing in on me, as if it were deliberately trying to obscure my path. After a while, I came across what looked like remnants of someone else's presence. A torn piece of fabric caught on a branch, a few scattered personal items, a broken compass, a faded map. They were the kind of things you'd expect to find in a forest, but something about their scattered arrangement seemed oddly deliberate. The items were weathered and old, as though they had been there for a while, yet they were all too recent to have been abandoned for years. My heart pounded with a mix of intrigue and apprehension. I pressed on, hoping to find something to take my mind off the eerie feeling settling over me. But the further I went, the more disorienting things became. The trees seemed to blur together, their shapes shifting in the corners of my vision. Every time I looked back, the trail behind me looked different, as if the forest itself were actively reshaping the path. It was as if the forest was playing tricks on me, making familiar landmarks seem foreign and confusing. Shadows twisted into bizarre shapes, and the once clear sound of a babbling brook became an unsettling, distant murmur that seemed to come from nowhere. The feeling of being watched grew stronger, almost tangible. It was like an invisible gaze following me, scrutinizing every step I took. By the time I decided to turn back, the forest had changed so much that I couldn't tell which direction led to my campsite. Panic began to set in as I realized that I might be lost. The sun was dipping below the horizon, and the forest was once again cloaked in darkness. The creeping sense of dread that had been building all day was now a full-blown terror. It felt like the forest itself was alive, and it was as if something was playing a cruel game with me. Every direction I turned seemed to lead me deeper into its suffocating grip. As I stumbled through the growing darkness, my anxiety heightened. The forest that had seemed merely eerie in daylight now felt overwhelmingly oppressive. The trees loomed like silent sentinels, their branches like skeletal fingers reaching out to trap me. Each step felt heavy, as if the very ground was resisting my escape. The growing gloom made it increasingly difficult to discern any familiar landmarks, and the once ordinary sounds of the forest had transformed into unsettling whispers and rustles. I tried to recall the landmarks I had passed earlier, but everything seemed to blend together in the encroaching darkness. My sense of direction was completely gone. Frustration and fear gnawed at me, making me question whether I had made a mistake in venturing so deep into the forest. I could no longer distinguish the path I had taken. It felt like the trees were closing in on me, their dense trunks and tangled undergrowth merging into a labyrinth of shadows. Then I saw something that made my blood run cold. Among the thick underbrush, I found a peculiar sight, a series of symbols carved into the bark of a tree. The carvings were crude but deliberate, arranged in a pattern that seemed almost ritualistic. They were surrounded by what looked like a crude, hastily made altar of stones. Atop the altar was a collection of odd trinkets, feathers, small bones, and a tarnished locket. The sight of these items, seemingly placed with some intent, filled me with an uneasy sense of foreboding. It was as if the forest itself was trying to tell me something, though I couldn't decipher its message. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was intruding on something ancient and sinister. The air grew colder, and a chill crept down my spine. I took a few steps back from the altar, my breath visible in the suddenly frigid air. As I turned to leave, I felt a strange sensation, the distinct impression of being watched. It was an intense feeling, as if eyes were boring into my back, scrutinizing my every move. My heart raced with a mix of fear and adrenaline. The path I had been following seemed to have vanished. In its place, the forest had become a twisted maze of shadows and indistinct shapes. I found myself walking in circles, every turn leading me deeper into an increasingly nightmarish landscape. The whispers that had previously been distant now seemed to be closing in on me, growing louder and more coherent. They were no longer just rustles. They were murmurs, hushed voices speaking in a language I could almost understand, but not quite decipher. Desperation set in as the night fully enveloped me. The darkness was so thick it felt like it was pressing in from all sides. I could barely see more than a few feet ahead, and every sound seemed amplified, every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves making me jump. My flashlight's beam flickered and dimmed, adding to my sense of disorientation and helplessness. In the silence that followed, I could hear my own panicked breathing, a reminder of just how alone and lost I felt. As I continued to wander, I noticed that the forest seemed to be shifting, the trees appearing to rearrange themselves as if mocking my attempts to find a way out. The oppressive darkness, combined with the eerie whispers and unsettling carvings, made me feel as though I was being led into a trap. The longer I stayed in the Black Forest, the more I felt like a pawn in some malevolent force's game, and the reality of my situation became more terrifying with each passing moment. The sense of disorientation was becoming overwhelming. I stumbled through the tangled underbrush, desperately trying to find some semblance of a recognizable path. The forest had transformed into a nightmarish maze, with trees and shadows seeming to twist and distort in the dim light of my flickering flashlight. The deepening darkness made every sound and movement feel magnified, and my own panic only added to the chaotic atmosphere. The path I had been following earlier was now completely gone, swallowed up by the encroaching wilderness. I tried to retrace my steps, but each turn seemed to lead me further into the heart of the forest. It was as if the very forest was alive, shifting and changing to prevent me from finding my way out. The feeling of being watched had intensified. It was no longer just a vague impression, but a palpable presence, like invisible eyes following my every move. As I pressed on, I noticed that the forest was becoming increasingly alien. The trees, once familiar and comforting, now seemed grotesque and menacing. Their gnarled branches reached out like twisted hands, and the shadows they cast seemed to form strange, unsettling shapes. I could swear that the shadows were moving, shifting in ways that defied logic. At times, they seemed to mimic my own movements, stretching and bending as if in mocking imitation. My flashlight's beam caught glimpses of things that made my skin crawl. A cluster of dark, unnatural shapes huddled together on the forest floor, which vanished the moment I tried to get a closer look. Faint, ghostly outlines flitting through the trees, disappearing when I tried to focus on them. Every now and then, I would hear a soft, almost inaudible whisper, like a voice carried on the wind, but when I tried to discern the words, it faded into silence. The deeper I went, the more distorted reality seemed. The forest's oppressive silence was occasionally broken by strange, eerie sounds. The distant cry of an animal, the rustling of leaves that sounded too deliberate, like footsteps. It felt like the forest was a living entity, actively manipulating my senses to disorient and terrify me. My heart pounded in my chest as I began to question whether I was truly alone or if something else was lurking just out of sight. In the midst of this growing terror, I came across something that made my blood run cold. A narrow, winding path that seemed almost deliberately hidden from view. It was overgrown and barely visible, but something about it felt strangely inviting, as if it were meant to be followed. Despite my growing fear, I felt compelled to take it, driven by a desperate hope that it might lead me to safety, or at least to something familiar. As I walked down this path, the forest seemed to close in even tighter around me. The oppressive darkness was almost suffocating, and the sense of being watched became overwhelming. I felt like I was walking through a living nightmare, with every step bringing me closer to some unknown, terrifying force. The whispers grew louder and more urgent, their tone now distinctly menacing. I could almost make out fragmented words and phrases, but they remained frustratingly elusive. At one point, I stumbled upon a small, abandoned cabin hidden deep in the forest. It was decrepit and forlorn, with broken windows and a sagging roof. The cabin seemed to be untouched by time, as if it had been left there for decades. The door creaked open with a slow, mournful sound, and I hesitated before stepping inside. The interior was dimly lit by the weak beam of my flashlight, revealing a dusty, cobweb-filled space that seemed frozen in time. I knew that I shouldn't stay here, but I was drawn to the cabin by a combination of fear and curiosity. As I explored its dark corners, I found strange, unsettling items scattered around. Old photographs, faded and cracked, depicting people whose eyes seemed to follow me wherever I went. The atmosphere in the cabin was thick with a sense of dread, as if it held secrets best left undisturbed. I knew I had to leave quickly, but the cabin seemed to hold me in its grip, its dark corners whispering promises of more horror yet to come. The sense of foreboding that had been creeping up on me all day reached its peak when I decided to leave the cabin. The oppressive darkness of the forest outside seemed to close in even tighter than before. My flashlight's beam barely cut through the thick, suffocating blackness, and every rustle of the leaves or snap of a twig sounded magnified and menacing. I felt a deep pang of fear and realization as I stumbled back into the forest. My campsite, once a point of refuge, now seemed like a distant memory. The forest had transformed into a labyrinth of shadows, each tree and bush blending into the next. The familiar landmarks I had used to orient myself had vanished, replaced by an unending expanse of trees that seemed to shift and sway, as if they were deliberately concealing my path. Panic set in quickly. I retraced my steps over and over, but nothing looked familiar. The forest floor seemed to be a shifting tapestry of tangled roots and underbrush, making every step a potential stumble. The silence was occasionally broken by the eerie sounds of the forest, distant cries, the whisper of the wind, and the unsettling thud of something heavy hitting the ground. My flashlight flickered ominously, its weak beam casting long, wavering shadows that only heightened my disorientation. I tried to call out, hoping to hear a response, but my voice was swallowed by the darkness. The cold air seemed to press in on me, making my breath visible in the dim light. Every sound, every shift in the darkness made my heart race with a mounting sense of dread. The forest's oppressive silence was suddenly shattered by a piercing, guttural scream, the kind of sound that makes your blood run cold and your skin prickle with fear. It was a cry of pure, unadulterated terror. I froze, paralyzed by the chilling realization that the scream seemed to come from somewhere deep within the forest, close enough to make me feel like I was not alone. My legs felt like lead as I forced myself to move, driven by a primal need to escape the malevolent presence I could feel encroaching on me. The whispers I had heard before were now louder and more distinct, forming a chorus of unsettling voices that seemed to speak in a language I couldn't understand. Their tone was increasingly urgent, almost as if they were warning me or beckoning me deeper into the forest. As I pushed through the underbrush, I noticed something out of place, a series of faint, flickering lights in the distance. They seemed to be beckoning me, a faint glimmer of hope in the otherwise suffocating darkness. I moved towards them, hoping they might lead to something recognizable or a way out of the forest. However, as I drew closer, the lights revealed themselves to be nothing more than a series of old, rusted lanterns hanging from the branches of the trees. They swung gently in the wind, casting eerie, shifting shadows across the ground. The sight of them only deepened my fear. The lanterns seemed to form a path, but it was a path that led deeper into the darkness, further away from any hope of rescue. In the midst of my panic, I stumbled upon another unsettling discovery, a small, makeshift camp with scattered belongings and a discarded tent. The items were tattered and old, as if they had been abandoned for years, yet there were signs that someone had been there recently. A half-burned candle, a dirty blanket, and a broken radio with its batteries long since dead. I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead. The camp was a stark reminder that others had ventured into this forest and had either never left or had been consumed by its dark, malevolent force. The thought of sharing their fate filled me with an intense, overwhelming fear. I had to get out before it was too late. As I moved away from the camp, the whispers grew louder, more insistent. It was as if the forest itself was actively trying to keep me there, to draw me into its dark heart. The trees seemed to close in on me, their branches reaching out like skeletal hands, and every step I took felt like it was leading me deeper into an inescapable nightmare. The deeper I ventured into the black forest, the more the sense of foreboding intensified. The shadows seemed to grow darker and more oppressive, and the whispers that had once been faint and distant were now a constant, unsettling presence. They seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, their incoherent murmurs blending with the rustling of leaves and the distant thud of something heavy moving through the undergrowth. My flashlight was now a barely glowing ember, casting weak, flickering light that barely penetrated the darkness. The forest around me felt alive, and every rustle or snap of a twig seemed to signal something sinister lurking just out of sight. The sense of being watched had become almost unbearable. It was as if invisible eyes were tracking my every move, their gaze cold and unyielding. I stumbled through the dense forest, my anxiety mounting with each passing minute. The oppressive darkness made it difficult to keep track of my bearings. I felt like I was wandering in circles, and each attempt to retrace my steps seemed to lead me further into the forest's heart. It was as if the trees themselves were conspiring to keep me trapped. Suddenly, I came across something that stopped me in my tracks, a series of grotesque, twisted figures hanging from the trees. They were made of what looked like old, decayed rags and were crudely fashioned into the shapes of humanoid figures. Their sight was both revolting and mesmerizing, the macabre art seeming to mock my predicament. The figures swayed gently in the breeze, their ragged limbs dangling lifelessly. The sight of these twisted effigies filled me with a deep sense of dread. It was as if I had stumbled upon a place of dark rituals, a place where ancient and malevolent forces were at work. My heart pounded with a mix of terror and revulsion, and I felt a cold sweat break out across my back. I was desperate to get away from this place, But the eerie display seemed to serve as a grim reminder that escape was not an option. As I moved away from the figures, I noticed that the forest seemed to grow even darker. The canopy above was so thick that it blocked out what little moonlight might have filtered through. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, and I could almost make out words, though they remained just out of reach of understanding. The voices were now accompanied by faint, unsettling noises, a distant, rhythmic thumping like the beat of a drum, and the occasional, eerie wail that seemed to come from deep within the forest. The path I was following seemed to dead end at a large, gnarled tree. Its trunk was thick and twisted, with strange, sinewy roots that seemed to writhe and move as if alive. At the base of the tree, there was a shallow depression filled with what looked like old, rusted metal objects, fragments of old tools and broken machinery. The debris was scattered haphazardly, creating an almost makeshift altar of sorts. My instincts screamed at me to leave, but a morbid curiosity kept me rooted to the spot. I noticed something strange about the objects in the depression. They were covered in a dark, viscous substance that glistened in the weak light of my flashlight. It was as if the metal had been coated in something otherworldly and sinister. My flashlight flickered again, casting eerie shadows on the surrounding trees, and I felt a growing sense of unease. The whispers seemed to swirl around me, louder and more frantic, urging me to leave. Desperately, I turned away from the strange altar and continued down a new path, hoping that it would lead me out of this nightmarish forest. But as I pushed forward, I felt a strange sensation, a prickling at the back of my neck, and an overwhelming feeling that something was closing in on me. The whispers had become a cacophony of voices, their urgency escalating as if they were trying to communicate something vital. The oppressive darkness seemed to close in even tighter, and the forest's labyrinthine paths only grew more confusing. The shadows twisted and writhed, creating unsettling patterns that danced just beyond the edge of my vision. I felt like I was walking through a living nightmare, with every step I took pulling me deeper into the forest's clutches. The feeling of being watched was now a constant, gnawing terror, and I knew that whatever was lurking in the Black Forest was not going to let me go without a fight. The deeper I ventured into the forest, the more the terror seemed to consume me. The trees were now twisted and gnarled, their branches forming grotesque shapes against the darkness. The once familiar forest floor had turned into a treacherous expanse of roots and underbrush, making every step a challenge. My flashlight was barely a flicker now, offering little comfort in the engulfing gloom. Each flicker seemed to reveal more unsettling details, amplifying my fear. I came upon a clearing that was eerily quiet. The air was thick with an unnatural stillness, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves. In the center of the clearing stood a dilapidated structure, an old stone well, half collapsed and covered in a thick layer of moss and vines. The well seemed ancient, its stones weathered and cracked, but what made it truly unsettling was the faint, rhythmic thudding that seemed to emanate from its depths. It was a slow, deliberate beat, like the pulse of something alive. A sense of dread washed over me as I approached the well. The thudding grew louder, more insistent, and I could feel the vibrations through the soles of my shoes. My flashlight's beam barely reached the dark void of the well, but I could see that the interior was filled with a murky, black water that seemed to shimmer unnaturally. The sight of the well filled me with an intense, inexplicable fear. It was as if the well was not just a physical structure, but a gateway to something far more sinister. I hesitated, my heart pounding furiously. The whispers had returned, louder and more frantic than before. They seemed to swirl around me, growing in intensity as if urging me to look deeper into the well. The voices were now discernible, their words overlapping and indistinct, creating a disorienting cacophony. It was as if the forest itself was trying to communicate something through the well. Driven by a mix of fear and curiosity, I leaned closer to the edge of the well. The air above the well was colder, and I could see my breath misting in front of me. As I peered into the darkness, I caught a glimpse of something that made my blood run cold. A pale, ghostly face reflected in the surface of the water. The face was distorted and twisted, with hollow eyes that seemed to stare right through me. I recoiled in horror, stumbling back from the edge of the well. The rhythmic thudding grew louder, more frantic, as if something was struggling to break free from the depths below. My flashlight flickered wildly, casting erratic shadows that danced across the clearing. I felt a surge of panic as I realized that the forest was closing in around me. The once unchanging trees seemed to be shifting, their branches moving with an almost deliberate intent, as if they were constricting around me. I turned to leave the clearing, but the path I had taken seemed to have vanished. The forest was now a chaotic blur of darkness and shifting shadows. I could feel the oppressive weight of the forest pressing down on me, and the whispers grew louder, almost deafening. It felt as though the very forest was trying to swallow me whole. Desperation set in as I stumbled through the forest, my flashlight barely illuminating a few feet in front of me. The rhythmic thudding continued, growing louder and more insistent, and the whispers became a frenzied chorus of voices. I felt as if I was being hunted by an unseen force, and every step I took seemed to draw me deeper into the forest's malevolent grasp. I finally came upon a small, narrow path that seemed to lead away from the clearing. It was overgrown and barely discernible, but it offered a glimmer of hope. I moved as quickly as I could, my heart racing and my breath coming in ragged gasps. The path wound through the trees, and the forest seemed to pulse with an almost sentient energy, as if it were aware of my every move. The rhythmic thudding and the whispers followed me, a constant reminder of the unseen presence that seemed to be closing in. My sense of direction was completely gone, and I felt like I was being drawn further into the forest's heart, where its ancient and malevolent secrets awaited. Each step felt like a struggle against an invisible force, and I knew that whatever was in the black forest was determined to keep me there. The forest seemed to close in on me, a living, breathing entity that refused to let me escape. The narrow path I had stumbled upon twisted and turned unpredictably, leading me deeper into the heart of the forest. My flashlight was now just a faint glow, barely cutting through the overwhelming darkness that pressed in from all sides. The rhythmic thudding from the well had grown into a relentless pounding, like a heartbeat echoing through the trees. The whispers were now a constant, maddening presence. They seemed to swirl around me, their voices overlapping and becoming increasingly frantic. I could hear snippets of phrases that sent chills down my spine. Not alone, lost forever, the darkness calls. The words were distorted and fragmented, but their meaning was clear. I was being drawn into something far beyond my comprehension. I stumbled through the underbrush, my mind racing with terror and exhaustion. The forest was a maze of shifting shadows and unrecognizable landmarks. The trees seemed to loom larger and more menacing with every step, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. I felt as though the forest was actively working to disorient and trap me, each turn leading me deeper into its dark embrace. My sense of time was distorted. It felt like I had been wandering for hours, yet the darkness remained impenetrable. I tried to keep my breathing steady, but the fear was overwhelming and my heart pounded in my chest like a drumbeat. The path seemed to stretch endlessly, and I began to doubt whether I would ever find my way out. Just when I was on the verge of despair, I saw a faint light in the distance. It was a weak, flickering glow that seemed to come from beyond the trees. Driven by a desperate hope, I pushed forward, moving as quickly as I could through the tangled underbrush. The light grew stronger, and I could make out the silhouette of a small cabin ahead. It was a simple structure, its windows glowing with a warm, inviting light. I approached the cabin with a mix of hope and trepidation. The sight of it was almost too good to be true, a beacon of safety in the oppressive darkness. As I reached the door, I hesitated for a moment, my hand trembling as I reached for the handle. The whispers had grown louder, their urgency now almost deafening. It was as if the forest was trying to warn me against entering. With a deep breath, I pushed open the door and stepped inside. The interior was dimly lit by a single, flickering lamp, and the air was musty and stale. The cabin was sparsely furnished with a few chairs, a table, and a bed in one corner. It was eerily quiet, and the silence was almost as oppressive as the darkness outside. I took a few tentative steps into the cabin, my eyes scanning the room for any signs of danger. On the table was an old, leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed with age. I felt an inexplicable compulsion to open it. As I flipped through the pages, I found entries written in a shaky, frantic hand. The entries described the experiences of someone who had been trapped in the forest long before me. They spoke of the same rhythmic thudding, the whispers, and the feeling of being watched. One entry, written in a frantic scrawl, caught my eye. The forest is alive. It feeds on fear. It will not let you go. You are part of its darkness now. The words sent a chill down my spine, and I realized with growing horror that the forest was not just a physical place, but a living, malevolent force. I tried to process what I had read, but my thoughts were interrupted by a loud, crashing noise outside. I rushed to the window and looked out into the darkness, but I could see nothing beyond the veil of shadows. The pounding sound was now a relentless, thunderous rhythm that seemed to shake the very foundation of the cabin. Desperate and terrified, I grabbed a flashlight from a shelf and tried to find another way out. But the cabin's door had somehow locked itself behind me, and the windows were barred. I was trapped. The forest had lured me into its clutches, and now it seemed determined to keep me there. The whispers grew louder, their voices melding into a cacophony of anguish and malevolence. The pounding outside was deafening, and I could feel the cabin vibrating with each beat. I could sense the darkness closing in around me, suffocating and unrelenting. In my final moments of consciousness, I realized the horrifying truth. The Black Forest was a place of ancient evil, a realm that preyed on the fear and despair of those who entered. It was a prison of shadows, a place where time and reality twisted together into a nightmarish existence. The forest had claimed me, and there was no escaping its dark embrace. As the darkness engulfed me, I could only hope that my story might serve as a warning to others who dared to enter the Black Forest.